Welcome back to Worldie Unboxed. In this episode, we're thrilled to feature Kevin Brooks, the founder of Baseway Footwear. Kevin's startup is developing a new concept designed to provide an improved fit for a wider range of athletes. Alongside his groundbreaking work at Baseway, Kevin also specializes in running product fit and function testing, collaborating closely with athletes and coaches to ensure optimal performance. In our conversation, Kevin shares his journey, the inspiration behind his love of footwear, and why he is developing this innovative product. Additionally, Kevin discusses the intricacies of last production, and we will get into what a last is, specifically the last that worldie is now using for our footwear, providing valuable insights into the technical aspects of shoe design. Stay connected with us by joining our community at worldiebrand.com and subscribing to the Worldie YouTube channel for clips and highlights from our conversations. All right, let's talk to Kevin. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Worldie Unboxed. Glad to have you on board.
Thanks for having me. It's my first ever podcast appearance. And yeah, I'm glad that there's like a lot of editing because I don't know if I don't know what to say I don't know how that works. So all the episodes, they seem so smooth when you finally air them. I'm like, oh, that person sounded like really smart that whole time. They didn't say one dumb thing, but
Yeah. No, it typically is pretty like smooth. There's not a whole lot of editing on my part, but every once in a while we'll run across a guest that will cause me to have to spend a great time editing. So I don't anticipate. We've had a couple of conversations before, so I don't anticipate us having to really like edit this thing too much. So one take, one
yeah, I
take.
think this is probably our third video call and we've been chatting on LinkedIn for a while. So excited to kind of do like a deeper dive on some of the stuff you're in development with.
Absolutely. So I mean, obviously we, like you kind of mentioned, have some familiarity with each other, but just for the sake of kind of letting the audience or the other listeners know exactly who you are, if you have an opportunity to kind of just like briefly explain your background and kind of how you got started into like shoe design and production.
Yeah, definitely. So I was an athlete growing up, loved playing sports, and I wasn't the fastest kid by any stretch of the imagination. I always was like, all right, how can I run faster? That was like my big thing. I played like baseball, football, those were my two main sports. Um, I was like above average baseball player, and football, I was just like riding the bench or playing tight end. And then as I got to high school, it flipped. So my sophomore year, I couldn't hit anything in baseball. And then I was about to become the starting quarterback for football for the varsity team. So I kind of started to focus a lot more on football. My senior year, I ended up, or my going into my senior year, I ended up skipping junior baseball and just running spring track. So that was kind of interesting. And then, I had an okay senior year, got a league all-star, and everyone's kind of like, wow, your speed really improved. So that was something I worked a ton on. And then I went to play college, D2 football. Didn't really get a ton of time there, but the whole time there, I was just like, all right, working really hard in the off season. I started to have like some hamstring, hip flexor, like all these things here and there. And I saw a physical therapist, and she was kind of like, all right, well, you seem to have a lot of like recurring like hip flexor, hamstring, quad pulls. I'm going to give you this like over the counter orthotic, like insole. And I put it in my shoe and I was like, oh my God, this thing is like amazing. Like I can feel it in my hips when I'm running now. And I was like really psyched about it. And I wore through that insole in about like a week and a half. And it's supposed to be like people wear them for like years. And so she gave me a custom orthotic, and I was like, okay, this is like kind of interesting. Um, so I was just like always kind of fascinated in how like something inside your shoe can affect the foot. And so I was really heavy into wearing like prescription orthotics from a podiatrist for probably about like 5 years. And I had a minor knee scope just like cleared some stuff up when I was about 26, 27. And I went to physical therapist, and my PT was like, all right, I'm going to get rid of that orthotic. Like, not today, but like after we work your hips, like you're not going to need this anymore. And so, we worked my hips a ton, and I was still having knee pain. And so he was like, not stumped, but he was like, all right, well, I'm going to send you to like a foot and ankle colleague that I have, because if you're having knee pain, it's either coming from the hips or the foot. So like your knee is just in the middle between like your hips and your foot. And so it's just going to go where those two things tell you to. And probably like 70-80% of the time, like the hip is driving the show. But sometimes like there's something going on at the foot that can be traveling upward. So as far as being in the footwear industry now, it's kind of interesting because everybody's like, oh, everything starts at the foot, everything comes up from the foot. And I don't think that's true for the majority of people. um, so right around that time I started working on my hips, and I saw this guy who did like a really interesting foot and ankle assessment on me. It was kind of like a light bulb moment. Like, I cannot believe this is how people look at flat feet and overpronation. Like, here I just got this like tangible measurement, and now everything makes sense. And I was starting to think about how like shoes impacted like your feet when you're walking and standing, and really did like a deep dive. And that kind of started about 10 years ago. And made a prototype shoe about 8 years ago that was zero drop concept. And this is like the shoe here. I put like a lot of miles on this, played a lot of
Okay.
golf, and even some basketball in it. So I remember I was like playing pickup with people I didn't know, and like if you saw me wearing this, some guy was like, "Oh, you're wearing like a skateboarding shoe? Like you shouldn't be playing basketball in that." And I was like, "I'll show you," type of thing. He had no clue that like I had spent like years researching this and develop, and how hard it is to make footwear. Um, and then uh, around that time, like getting married, getting a house, I was like kind of shifting, and I met somebody who was working on an insole project, and they're trying to put technology into footwear. And so I kind of shifted to start helping them out. And that's been a really interesting project as well. And now I'm starting to work on my own footwear again, some years later, just because I've kind of learned a lot in the last few years about biomechanics, and had some friends had some significant injuries that I think the footwear industry can do a little bit more about.
No, that's what's up. That's a crazy story. So yours is actually an actual pain point, a physical pain point that kind of led you to footwear production, footwear design.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that's a pretty cool like story, like very very detailed. So we're probably you mentioned earlier on in your story about how there's a faction in the footwear industry that believes it starts at the foot and then kind of like goes up. And I guess Aaron and I have probably, and Aaron, you can definitely chime in if it's incorrect, if I'm summarizing it incorrectly, but we're kind of that faction that we believe that like, okay, it kind of starts with the foot, and then from there you're able to kind of like make some tweaks and changes when it comes from like an athletic standpoint. Um, but you said you don't have that or you don't share that same sentiment.
No, so I think if you look at how movement occurs, generally call it from like proximal to like the center of your body outward. So the
Yeah.
example I use is when they talk about quarterbacks. I played quarterback a long time ago, and it's like, oh, he just flicked his wrist.
Yeah.
And Pat Mahomes is a great example of this. The first thing that moves is his hips. He has like great hip rotation, and then his shoulders come through, and then his elbow, and then his wrist, and then his fingertips. So everything starts from the center. And even if you were to watch, there was a video somebody posted on social media. They were like almost standing on a glass surface, and they went into a squat, and you could see the hip went into flexion, and then the foot went into flexion, and then the hip went into extension, and then the foot went into extension. So sequentially it's actually starting from the hip. And we found, I do some coaching, like sprinting and weight room stuff with the high school kids, and for a lot of them, if they're not moving well, if you just clean up their hip movement, everything at the foot will kind of take care of itself. But definitely, maybe like 25-30% will need a little extra footwork.
Gotcha. So then why is there such an emphasis placed on footwear when it comes to like athletics?
By who do you mean?
By I would assume like for me, and this may be just like anecdotal, but like I
Mhm.
place a big amount of emphasis on the proper footwear when going into like any sport. Like I always think about that's probably like one of my first purchases when I'm going into any sport. It's like, oh, dude, I got to make sure I have the right shoes for this because
Right.
it affects my play like the most. And then from
Yeah.
and this is like obviously not every single sport, but like the majority of sports. For like golf might be a little bit different for me. Like I might like start with a club because I'm feeling like a
Mhm.
club is going to be like the most impactful part of play. But for like any other sport, whether it's like basketball or football or soccer or running or whatever. I mean, obviously running maybe it kind of it is.
Yeah.
But like, I'm always thinking about that first. And I'm thinking about that as being the most impactful part of my performance.
Yeah. So if I'm looking at like coaching an athlete, the first priority is get their hips right because if their
Yeah.
hips aren't right, the footwear isn't going to save them. But let's say, okay, your hips are good. There's no equipment that you're really wearing on your hips that's going to restrict it.
Okay.
Okay, so then the second thing I'll look at is how's their foot and ankle move. So if their foot and ankle moves horribly without a shoe on, it's not going to start moving well even with the shoe on, despite all those like insole and orthotic companies saying, "Oh, look at this horrible foot pot. Now we put it in the right one." So for me, it gets to a point where, all right, the hips are working well, the foot is working well without a shoe on, but I'm putting the shoe on and now there's some restriction, or you're not able to be as quick or competitive as somebody you're playing against. So even though the hips are more important than the feet, and the feet are more important than the shoe still plays like a gigantic role. So let's call it like 10-15% of the equation. That can be a huge percentage when you're like playing competitive sport like basketball or soccer. It's massive, especially if you're playing against somebody who's more athletic than you. So like one of my buddies I grew up with, like, he's more athletic than me. And I'm like, all right, so how can I get any advantage? Because if I'm in a worse shoe than him, he's going to destroy me.
Yeah. So would you say that like that 10-15% is consistent across like all age levels? Or do you think it changes?
So it can really, it can really significantly impact younger athletes. And I think because they're so mobile and they don't necessarily know, okay, like this is how my foot and ankle is supposed to set before I like hit propulsion. I sent you guys like a picture of like the kid's shoe where the kid is like perfectly neutral. And then another shoe, they're like completely thrown to the inside. So, why do I make shoes? I think shoes have like a huge structural influence on how the foot and ankle, functions. So it's smaller part of the equation than people think, but it's massive in how much it affects it.
Gotcha. Okay. And maybe we'll hit on that again, but we'll move on to one of the reasons why we kind of reached out to you. Maybe not initially, but lately, and that's been the development of Elast. And
Mhm.
we reached out to you because we knew that you had like an obsession with it. All right, this guy has a lot of good inputs, and like I say obsession in like a positive way. Like, okay, he has a positive, a healthy obsession with getting the shoe correctly designed so that it's like a not a hindrance, but something that is actually like a positive attribute of like equipment when you're donning it. So
Mhm.
we showed you a last that we were using for that we were potentially going to use, and you had some feedback on it. And then this past week, or maybe it was yesterday, we showed
Yep.
you our newest version, our newest last. And before we kind of get into that, because not everyone's going to have an understanding of what a last is. Could you like explain a little bit of a last? Why is it important to like footwear production, and what are some things to kind of look out for generally?
Yeah. So the expression is that the last comes first. And so this is like a physical last. And it's pretty much like the inside mold that you build the shoe around. And so like how high you want like the first metatarsal to be, whether you want that to be like high or low, like what you want the toe box shape to be like, what you want like your heel fit to be. The big one is like the heel to toe drop a lot in the toe spring. Toe spring's like super controversial. All those features are built into the last. So I don't think the last comes first. I think your concept has to come first of, okay, I'm building an athletic shoe for this age group and I want it to be able to do X, Y, Z. And I want like the shoe to have like this amount of pop for this exercise. I want to be able to do this. And the really challenging thing about footwear is even the most flexible shoes are going to take away foot mobility. And so the position of the last is going to be the most comfortable position that your foot is inside that shoe. And so that's really a huge challenge is okay, what's the position you want your foot to be in if it's not applying like any force whatsoever to the shoe? And then what other positions can I get my foot into from there? And so this is a last that on the first project I worked with, um, so I generally look at the last as like, okay, top view, how does it look? What's the side view features, heel to toe drop, toe spring. And then I also look at, some other like significant views.
Awesome. So, when you looked at our last, the first one, you had some
Mhm.
comments, and then when you looked at this current version of it, what were the improvements that you saw? And then what are some things that you were like, I'm still kind of concerned about this.
Yeah, so the last is not a human foot. That's
No,
one
no.
thing that people don't
I guess
understand.
a lot of people would be listening and not maybe like being able to like watch this. The last, it kind of almost mimics like a mannequin's foot. Like you see like a mannequin like on display, like you see the little mannequin. It's an unformed, like there's no like toes or anything. It's just like
Mhm.
uh almost like the embodiment of a foot without actually having the details of the foot.
Right.
That's
So there's
great.
a couple of things that are built into a last that if you were to say, okay, I met this guy at like a trade show and he was talking about a colleague that was always trying to make a last that was like exactly like a human foot. And there's a couple of features in a last, like for example, like where this stops right here will keep like your foot from like sliding forward within a shoe. And like a lot of the taper that you see on really athletic shoes, again, that'll kind of like keep the ball of your foot in place. And so if you had like a really wide toe box, potentially there's less things that's going to keep your foot in place. Now you can make up for that in other ways, but um, for your first one, it just looked like the foot might not be as secure in athletic movements. And so you always have to kind of think, all right, is this shoe made for comfort only? Is it made for really high performance athletics, or is it made for somebody to be like comfortable while they're doing some athletic movements? So, like a track shoe is not going to be comfortable. Like if you're watching a movie, you don't want to be wearing a track shoe for like 3 hours, but you don't want to be wearing like, loose slippers while you're running the 100 either. So it looked like it's a little bit more secure athletically. Um, and so a lot of the features that people talk about within footwear, I'll read them online and I'll say, oh, this has like a really deep heel cup and this has great arch support. And you slice up the shoe and you're like, there's zero arch support underneath this shoe. But most shoes actually don't have a ton of arch support.
Would you say arch support is pretty necessary in shoes, or is it like unnecessary? I know there's like a couple schools of thought.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the activity, it depends on the individual and the age range. It depends on if they need it or not. So there's like huge thing years ago with like the barefoot movement that was like, okay, if you have arch support within the shoe, it's going to make your foot weak. And there's a whole, if you guys want to go down that rabbit hole, we can. And then there's the other extreme, which will say, you need arch support within your shoe because, X, Y, Z. So you absolutely need it. And the answer is probably like somewhere in the middle for most people.
Yeah, and we've also heard that, especially when it comes to kids, like art support can be a detriment to development. Like it prevents the natural development of the foot because it's kind of like um, you're giving yourself a crutch or whatever, and you're not allowing for proper development because you're kind of leaning on this art support as opposed to like allowing your foot to develop properly and provide its own like support.
Yeah, so the biggest thing is that the arch naturally will lower during mid stance. So like early stance, the arch is a little bit higher, and mid stance it will lower. That doesn't mean it completely collapses. So again, everything I see online is people say, all right, well, you need your arch to like completely pronate, or you don't need any pronational, but there's like very slight arch drop. So if you're having like a young athlete, you don't want that arch support to interfere with their natural movement. But on the other hand, with if you have like an older athlete and they have no control of their foot whatsoever, and it doesn't matter if we take arch support away, or it doesn't matter, they have no control of their foot, then symptom treatment might be necessary. And the question you have with kids is, okay, is that part of their development that their arch is lower at this age and higher at this age, and we need to kind of let that work itself out rather than putting in like a symptom treatment like too early in their development.
Got it. No, that makes sense. Last question that I have, and this is kind of like just selfishly help for us as we get ready for our first production run. And so we're having our samples come out here shortly. Um, what are some things that we need to be looking for? Like, what are some gotchas when when we've gotten past the last development design, like we've got our tech pack or whatever. Like, what are some things that we need to be like concerned about with the production run?
Um, Yeah, so once you finalize the last, things can move pretty quickly. So if you say, okay, this is the last that we're going forward with. Now, the thing that I kind of got caught up with the first time I did this is I didn't realize like how important the bottom profile of the last was.
Mhm.
So whenever you want the top of your midsole to be shaped like, the bottom of the last needs to match that. So I had like a 2D blueprint of a shoe, and like the bottom of the last, looked like a cup, and then like, this was like a little bit flatter. And the developer overseas kind of like, okay, well, they need to match each other. So you either need to change the blueprint or you need to change your last. And you just don't want to figure that out too late. So I think like I said, the planning beforehand of, what do your cross sections look like on your arch, your heel, your forefoot? What's the side section look like of your heel to toe drop and your toe spring? And whatever you want that to be, make sure you discuss that with, your development team and make sure it's built into the last the way you want it. And the only other piece of advice is don't stray too far from like the industry standard last because something that works on paper might not work like in reality. And that was another thing I learned from like trying different ways to achieve zero drop
Mhm.
is there's different points of emphasis like the tread point under the ball of the foot is super important. um you know how much room the ball, it's all to me about how well does the heel fit, how well is the ball of the foot, and then is there any effect that's going to accelerate your loading process? Is there anything to catch like a poor loading process? And do you want to build those things into your shoe or not?
Got it. Yeah, we might have already kind of like pushed against one of the recommendations that you just mentioned in terms of not straying too far away from industry standard because we wanted to create a last that was specifically designed for kids, so just using kids data as opposed
Mhm.
to adult data that's being taken down or grade it down to kid sizes.
Yeah.
And so we emphasize that with Jones and Vining, which is like one of the major last producing companies out there, where
Mhm.
people probably are unfamiliar with last and thus unfamiliar with people or companies that produce last. So we ended up like emphasizing that with them to make sure that this last and therefore this shoe is designed specifically for kids and not with any kind of input that typically is taken from adult men's footwear and kind of like scaled down. So it may be a bit different, but you said you didn't really kind of like looking at our last, didn't really kind of like notice anything that kind of stood out and made it seem like, okay, this is like a total 180 from like what the industry's doing.
No, so I think you guys have a great balance where the last doesn't look like something from an alien planet, but you can definitely tell that, okay, it's made for kids. And so finding that sweet spot where you're not necessarily trying a concept that is really going to change like fundamentally how the foot's going to work, but
Yeah.
also you're incorporating like kids fit, kids movement. And so I think if you're able to hit that sweet spot, that's why I want to help you guys out. It's awesome.
Yeah. No, we definitely hope we're gonna hit that sweet spot. So we'll see here in the coming weeks. Like I said, that was probably all the questions that we have, unless Aaron, you have some more.
I don't think so. I guess just remind me, like Kevin, how did me and you first meet? Because I know we've been kind of like going back and forth for a while, but I can't remember how you even came on my radar or vice versa.
Um, I think I just came across you on LinkedIn. I follow a lot of footwear people. I follow a lot of like strength performance coaches, athletic trainers, physical therapists, podiatrists, and somebody must have liked something that you commented on, and I think I reached out to you, and we just kind of started connecting a little bit. So it's been fun to watch you guys' journey, and my day job, I do a lot of driving. I might be visiting different offices that are like an hour, 2 hours apart from each other. So you can put on the podcast and kind of listen to different founders you have and kind of get a glimpse into footwear world and startup world in general.
Well, now you get an opportunity to hear yourself. But no, certainly appreciate it. And then I realize now that I didn't use the right Zoom session because it's like a timer on here. So um, I'll have to remedy that. Glad we kept it up under what is it, 30 minutes that they give you?
I think
I think
they
it's
usually give you
40.
40.
40,
Yeah.
40 minutes? Okay. So yeah, no, we're not so cheap, Kevin, that we haven't already got the we just
Yeah. We're on the free Zooms here. We're pretty early in our
no,
companies.
no. We have a pro version, but I failed to use that account, so and I recognize it now. But again, it's awesome chatting, awesome like having you on the podcast. Um, can't wait to pick your brain more as we get to that next step. So yeah, definitely appreciate it, man.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on and look forward to chatting soon and watching your development.